Hello, hello, hello. Is this work? Okay, sorry, I couldn't see them on here. Though I am still worried. Okay. Either way, hello, this is Chiak. We are back again with a cold read of Resident Evil Code Veronica, the novelization version, the novelization of Resident Evil Code Veronica. Starting this reading session with Chapter 4. Chris Redfield and Barry Burden were reloading rounds in the back room of the pair's safe house. Silent and tense, neither of them speaking. It had been a bad 10 days, not knowing what had happened to Claire, not knowing if Umbrella still had her alive. Stop, his inner voice said firmly. She's alive. She has to be. To even entertain the alternative was unthinkable. He'd been telling himself that for 10 days, and it was wearing thin. It had been bad enough hearing that she'd been in Raccoon City for the final meltdown, and that she'd gone there looking for him. Leon Candy, her young cop friend, had filled him in on the details at their first meeting. She survived Raccoon only to be hijacked by Trent on the way to Europe. She and Leon and the three renegade stars, they ended up facing off with yet another group of Umbrella monsters at a facility in Utah. Chris hadn't known about any of it, had ignorantly assumed that she was still safely studying away at the university. Hearing that she'd got entangled up in the fight against Umbrella was bad, all right, but knowing that Umbrella had captured her, that his little sister might already be dead, it was killing him, eating him up inside. It was all he could do not to barge into Umbrella's headquarters with a couple of machine guns and start demanding answers, even knowing that it would be suicide. Barry pumped the shell loader while Chris scooped up the fresh rounds and boxed them, the acrid, familiar scent of gunpowder fusing the air. He was relieved that his old friend seemed to understand his need for silence. The steady click click of the loader, the only sound in the small room. It was also a relief to have something to do after a full week of sitting still and praying, hoping that Trent might contact them with news or to offer help. Chris had never met Trent, but the mysterious stranger had aided the stars a few times in the past, passing along inside information about Umbrella. Although his exact motivations were unknown, his objectives seemed clear enough to destroy the pharmaceutical company's secret bioweapon division. Unfortunately, waiting on Trent was a long shot. He'd only ever contacted them when it suited his needs, and since they had no way of reaching him, the prospect of his assistance was seeming less likely all the time. Click, 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 click. The repetitive sound was soothing somehow, a muted mechanical process in the quiet of the rented safe house. They all had specific jobs to do in their pledge to bring Umbrella down, tasks that changed from day to day as the need arose. Chris had been helping Barry out with the weapons for the past week and a half, but he usually ran HQ surveillance. They'd reached they received a message from Jill a few weeks before. She was on her way to Paris. Jill and Chris knew that her misspent youth would come in very handy for internal recon. Leon had turned out to be a half decent hacker. He was in the next room on the computer. He'd hardly slept since Claire's capture, most of his time spent trying to track Umbrella's recent movements, and the trio of stars who'd come with Claire and Leon to Europe. Rebecca from the disbanded Raccoon Squad, and the two stars from Maine, David and John, were currently off in London, meeting with an arms dealer. After all they'd been through together, the three of them worked well as a team. There aren't many of us, We got the skills and the determination. Claire, though. With both their parents dead, he and Claire had developed a close relationship. He thought he knew her pretty well. She was smart and tough and resourceful, always had been. But she was also a college student, for Christ's sakes. Unlike the rest of them, she didn't have any formal combat training. He couldn't help thinking that she'd been lucky so far, and when it came to Umbrella, luck just wasn't enough. Chris, get in here. Leon, Leon, and it sounded urgent. Chris and Barry looked at each other. Chris seeing his own worry mirrored in Barry's face, and they both stood up. His heart in his throat. Chris hurriedly led the way down the hall to where Leon was working, feeling eager and afraid at once. The young cop was standing next to the computer, his expression unreadable. She's alive, Leon said simply. Chris hadn't even been aware of how bad things had been for him until those two words. It was like his heart had suddenly been released after being gripped in a vice for 10 days. The sense of relief, as physical as it was emotional, his skin flushing with it. Alive. She's alive. Barry clapped him on the shoulder, laughing. Of course she is. She's a Redfield. Chris grinned, turned his attention back to Leon, and felt his smile slipping at the cop's carefully neutral expression. There was something else. Before he could ask, Leon motioned at the screen, taking a deep breath. They got her on an island, Chris, and there's been an accident. Chris was leaning over the computer in a single stride. He read the brief message twice, the reality of it slow to sink in. Infection trouble approximately 337 south, 12 west, following attack, perps unknown. No bad guys left, I think, but stuck at the moment. Watch your back, bro. They know the city, if not the street. We'll try to be home soon. Chris stood up, silently locking gazes with Leon as Barry read the message. Leon smiled, but it looked forced. You didn't see her in Raccoon, he said. She knows how to handle herself, Chris, and she managed to get to a computer, right? Barry straightened up, took his cue from Leon. That means she's not locked down, he said seriously. And if Umbrella's got its hands full with another viral spill, they're not going to be paying attention to anything else. The important thing is that she's alive. Chris nodded absently, mind already working on what he would need for the trip. The coordinates she'd listed put her in an incredibly isolated spot, deep in the South Atlantic. But he had an old Air Force buddy who owed him. Could jet him down to Buenos Aires, maybe Cape Town. He could rent a boat from there, survival gear, rope, med kit, an ass load of firepower. I'm going with you, Barry said, accurately reading his expression. They'd been friends a long time. Me too, Leon said. Chris shook his head. No, absolutely not. Both men started to protest, and Chris raised his voice, talking over them. You saw what she said about Umbrella hooning in on me on us, he said firmly. That means we have to relocate. Maybe one of the estates outside the city. Someone has to stay here, wait for Rebecca's team to get back, and someone else needs to scout out a new base of operations. And don't forget, Jill will be here any day now. Barry frowned, scratched at his beard, his mouth set in a thin, tight line. I don't like it. Going in alone is a bad idea. We're at a crucial phase right now, and you know it, Chris said. Somebody's got to mind the shop. Barry. Somebody's got to mind the shop, Barry, and you're the man. You got the experience, you know all the contacts. Fine, but at least take the kid, Barry said, gesturing toward Leon. For once, Leon didn't protest the label, only nodded, drawing himself up, shoulders back and head high. If you don't want to do it for yourself, think about Claire, Barry continued. What happens to her if you get yourself killed? You need a backup, somebody to pick up the ball if you fumble. Chris shook his head, immovable. You know better, Barry. This has to be as quiet as possible. Umbrella may have sent Umbrella may have already sent in a cleanup crew. One person in and out before anyone even realizes I'm there. Barry was still frowning, but he didn't push it. Neither did Leon, although Chris could see that he was working up to it. The cop and Claire had obviously gotten pretty close. I'll bring her back, Chris said, softening his tone, looking at Leon. Leon hesitated, then nodded, high color burning in his cheeks, making Chris wonder exactly how close Leon and his sister had become. Later, I can worry about his intentions if we make it back alive. When we make it back alive, he quickly amended. If was not an option. It's settled then, Chris said. Leon, find me a good map of the area. Geographical, political, everything. You never know what might help. Also post back to Claire, just in case she gets another chance to check for messages. Tell her I'm on my way. Barry, I want to be packing major influence, but lightweight. Something I can hike in without too much trouble. Maybe a Glock. You're the expert. You decide. Both men nodded, turning away to get started, and Chris closed his eyes for just a second, quickly offering up a silent prayer. Please stay safe until I get there, Claire. It wasn't much, but then Chris had the feeling he would be praying a lot more in the long hours to come. The hidden monitor room was behind a wall of books in the Ashfords' private residence. Upon his return to their home, secreted behind the official receiving mansion, Alfred slung his rifle and immediately walked to the wall, touching the spines of 3 books in quick succession. He felt 100 pairs of eyes observing him from the front hall shadows, and though he had long since grown used to Alexia's scattered collection of dolls, he often wished that they wouldn't always watch him so intensely. There were times that he expected some privacy. As the wall pivoted open, he heard the whistling chitter of bats hiding in the eaves and frowned, pursing his lips. It seemed that the attic had been breached during the attack. No mind, no mind. Concerns for another day. He had more important business that demanded his attention. Alexia had apparently retreated to her rooms once more, which was just as well. Alfred didn't want her upset any further, and news of a possible assassin at Rockport would certainly achieve that. He stepped inside the hidden room and pushed the carefully balanced wall closed behind him. There were usually 75 different camera shots that he could choose from to watch on any of the 10 small monitors in the small room, but much of the equipment around the compound had been damaged or destroyed, leaving him with only 31 usable images. Knowing Claire's foul objectives to steal information and search for Alexia, Alfred decided to focus on her approach from the prison compound. He had no doubt that she would appear shortly. One such as her would not have the good manners to die in the attack or its aftermath, though, as his expectations built, his interest in the game growing, he began to feel anxious that she might, in fact, have expired. Thankfully, his initial assumption had been correct. Another of the prisoners came through the main gate first, but he was followed shortly by the Redfield girl. Amused at their halting progress, Alfred watched as Claire tried to catch up to the young woman. Alfred watched as Claire tried to catch up to the young man, prisoner 267, according to the back of his uniform, who seemingly had no idea that he was being pursued. As the young man topped the stairs that led up from the prison area and stood uncertainly looking between the palace grounds and the training facility, Alfred entered 267 into the keypad beneath his left hand and found the name, Stephen Burnside. It meant nothing to him, and as the boy hesitated indecisively, Alfred found his attention moving back to his quarry, curious about the young woman who was soon to be his short term playmate. Claire was walking across the damaged chasm bridge only a moment or two behind Burnside, walking high on the balls of her feet like an athlete. She seemed quite self possessed, cautious, but unapologetic about her right to cross the span. But she was also careful not to look down into the mist filled darkness, the massive crevice walls extending down hundreds of feet, nor did she linger. In the warm security of his home, Alfred smiled, imagining her delicious fear, and found himself remembering the trick that he and Alexia had once played on the guard. They'd been 6 or 7 years old, and Francois Selot had been a shift commander, one of their father's favorites. He'd been a fawning sycophant, a bootlick, but only to Alexander Ashford. Behind their father's back, he had dared to laugh cruelly at Alexia one afternoon when she had tripped in a pouring rain, splashing her new blue dress with mud. Such an offense was not to be withstood. How we planned, talking late into the night, about a suitable punishment for his unforgivable behavior. Our child minds alive and whirling with all the possibilities. The final plan had been simple, and they executed it perfectly only 2 days later, when Francois had duty as guard of the main gate. Alfred had sweetly begged the cook to let him bring Francois his morning espresso, a chore he'd often perform for favored employees, and on the way to the chasm bridge, Alexia had added a special twist to the strong, bitter brew. Just a few drops of a curare-like substance she'd synthesized herself. The drug paralyzed flesh, but allowed the nervous system to continue working, so that the recipient couldn't move or speak, but could feel and understand what was happening to him. Alfred had approached the prison gate slowly, so slowly that the impatient Francois had stalked out to meet him. Smiling, aware that Alexia had returned to the residence, was watching and listening from the monitor room. Alfred had been wearing a small microphone. He'd stepped close to the railing before apologetically offering the Dimitas cup to Francois. Both twins had watched in secret delight as the guard swilled it down, and in seconds he was gasping for air, leaning heavily against the bridge rail. To anyone watching, it appeared only that the man and boy were looking out across the chasm, except for Alexia, of course, who later told him that she applauded his performance of innocence. I looked at him, at the frozen expression of fear on his unrefined features, and explained what we had. Oh, wait, sorry, wrong voice. I looked up at him, at the frozen expression of fear on his unrefined features, and explained what we had done and what we were going to do. Francois had actually managed a soft squealing noise through his clenched jaw when he finally understood that he was helpless to defend himself against a child. For almost 5 minutes, Alfred had cheerfully cursed Francois as the spawn of pigs, as a mannerless peasant, and had jabbed him in the meat of his thigh with a sewing needle too many times to count. Paralyzed, Francois Selot could only endure the pain and humiliation, surely regretting his beastly conduct toward Alexia as he suffered in silence. And when Alfred had tired of their game, he kicked the guard's dirty boot heels a few times, describing his every sensation to Alexia as Francois slid helplessly beneath the rail and plummeted to his death. And then I screamed and pretended to cry as others came rushing across the bridge, trying desperately to console their young master. They asked one another how such a terrible thing could happen. And later, much later, Alexia came into my room and kissed my cheek, her lips warm and soft, her silken tresses tickling my throat. The martyrs tore his attention away from his sweet memories. Claire, now standing at the same spot where Burnside had hesitated, quite put out with himself for his lack of care, Alfred spent an uncertain moment searching for the young hoodlum, switching between cameras, finally spotting him on the very steps of the receiving mansion. Quickly, Alfred checked his console's control panels to be sure that all the mansion doors were unlocked, suspecting that the boy would probably hang himself easily enough, and crowed with delight when he saw that Claire was following, having chosen the same path as her young friend. How much more exquisite her terror will be when she pleads for her life kneeling in Mr. Burnside's cooling blood. If he meant to greet them properly, he needed to leave right away. Alfred stood and opened the wall once more, his excitement rising as he closed it behind him and stepped out into the great hall. He very much wanted to tell Alexia his plans before leaving, to share a few of his ideas, but was concerned that time was a factor. "I'll be watching, my dear," she said. Startled, Alfred looked up to see her at the top of the stairs, not far from the life-sized child doll that hung from the uppermost balcony, one of Alexia's favorite toys. He started to ask her how she knew, but realized how silly a question it was. Of course she knew, because she knew his heart. It was the same that beat within her own snowy white breast. "Go now, Alfred," she said, gracing him with her smile. "Enjoy them for the both of us." "I will, sister," he said, smiling in turn. Sorry, excuse me, I'm trying to get comfortable. "I will, sister," he said, smiling in turn, thankful anew that he was brother to such a miracle of creation, lucky that she so understood his needs and desires. Sorry, I'm just checking. Oh. It was like some bizarre reality twist, Claire decided, closing the mansion doors behind her. Far from the ramshackle, death-filled cold of the dark prison yards to where she stood now, it was hard to believe, and yet so like an umbrella that she had no choice. But goddamn, I mean, seriously? The grand, beautifully designed sunken lobby spread out in front of her was marred only by a few sets of muddy footprints across the hand-tiled floor, a few splotches of blood painted across the delicate eggshell walls. There were also a number of large cracks near the ceiling, and a single maroon handprint drying on one of the thick decorative columns that lined the west wall, thin rivulets of red streaking down from the base of the palm. So the prisoners weren't the only ones to suffer a shitty afternoon. It was classist and petty of her, she knew, but it made her feel a little better to know that the umbrella higher-ups had taken an ass-kicking along with everybody else. She stood where she was for a moment, relieved to be out of the cold and still mildly shocked by the different faces of the Rockfort's facility as she took in the layout. Behind one of the columns to her left was a blue door. A second door in the northwest corner of the spacious room. Straight ahead was a polished mahogany reception desk, abutting an open flight of stairs along the right wall that led up to a second floor balcony, richly hung with a strangely damaged portrait. The face of the portrait subjects had been scratched out for some reason. Claire stepped down into the lobby, crouched, and ran a finger through one of the muddy footprints. Still wet, and more tracks leading to the corner door. She couldn't be certain they were Steve's, but thought the odds were pretty good. She'd left a trail. He'd left a trail from the open prison gate to a couple of dropped shells casings just outside the mansion, along with two more dead dogs. For such an obviously troubled young man, he was a surprisingly accurate shot. So why am I going through so much trouble to help him out? She thought sourly, standing. He doesn't want my assistance, doesn't seem to need it, and it's not like I don't have anything better to do. When he'd taken off running, she hadn't followed immediately, wanting to get a message to Leon ASAP. She also felt obliged to run a quick search of the office for medical supplies, something to help Rodrigo, but she hadn't found anything useful. Help me! Help me! A muffled shout from somewhere in the building. Steve? Let me out! Hey, somebody help! Claire was already running for the corner door. Weapon up, she slammed into the heavy wood, the door crashing open into a long hallway. Steve shouted again from the far end of the corridor. Claire hesitated just long enough to see that the three bodies sprawled on the tiled floor weren't going to get up, and then ran, fixing the door straight ahead as the one. Help! Jesus, what's happening to him? He sounded panic-stricken, his voice breaking with it. Reaching the end of the hall, Claire shoved at the door, ran in sweeping with a handgun, and saw nothing. A room with display cases and stuffed chairs. An alarm was buzzing somewhere, but she didn't see its source. Movement to the left, Claire spun, desperate for a target, and saw that a piece of film was being projected on a small wall screen, silent and flickering. Two attractive blonde children, a boy and a girl, staring intently into each other's eyes. The boy was holding something wriggling, a dragonfly, and he's. Claire looked away, involuntarily disgusted. The boy was pulling the wings off of the struggling insect, smiling, both of them smiling. Steve? Why wasn't he shouting anymore? Where was he? She had the wrong room, must be. Claire! Claire, in here! Open the door! His voice was coming from behind the projection screen. Claire dashed across the room, searching the wall, absently aware that the tow-headed children had dropped the tortured dragonfly into a container full of ants, were watching the crippled bug being stung to death. What door? Where? Claire shouted, running anxious hands over the wall, pushing at a glass display case, pulling at the screen, and the screen rised up, disappearing into a slot. Behind it was a console, a keyboard, and 6 picture boxes in 2 rows of 3, a switch beneath each one. Claire, do something! I'm burning up! What do I do? How did you get in there, Steve? No answer, and she could hear the rising desperation in her voice, could feel it eating into her brain. Concentrate. Do it now. Claire clamped down on her near panic. The clearer voice in her mind, the voice of intellect. If she panicked, Steve would die. There was no door. There's a console with boxes. Yes, that was it. That was the key. Steve yelled out another terrified plea, but Claire only looked at the boxes, focusing. Each is different. A boat, an ant, a gun, a knife, a gun, an airplane. They weren't all different. There were 2 guns, a semi-automatic handgun and a revolver. The switches labeled C and E. Nothing else matched, and her first thought was that it was like one of those grade school tests. Which 2 are alike? Without questioning her reasoning, Claire reached out and flipped the 2 switches, the 2 boxes lighting up, and to her right, the display case slid out from the wall. The buzzing alarm stopped. The blast of dry, baking heat expelled from the opening, washing over her. A half second later, Steve stumbled out and dropped to his knees, his arms and his face beet red. He was holding a pair of matching handguns, what looked like a gilded loggers. Guess I picked the right boxes. She leaned over him, trying to remember what the signs of heat stroke were. Dizziness and nausea, she thought. Are you okay? Steve gazed up at her. With his flushed cheeks and vaguely embarrassed expression, he resembled nothing so much as a little boy who had too much sun. Then he grinned, and the illusion was lost. What took you so long? He cracked, pushing himself to his feet. Claire straightened, scowling. You're welcome. His grin softened, and he ducked his head, pushing thick bangs away from his forehead. Sorry. And I'm sorry about before, too. Thanks. Seriously. Claire sighed. Just when she decided he was a total asshole, he decided to be nice. And look what I got, he said, snapping both handguns up and aiming at one of the display cases. They were hanging on the wall back there, fully loaded and everything. Cool, huh? She had to resist a sudden urge to grab his shoulders and shake some sense into him. He had nerve, she'd give him that, and he obviously had at least a few survival skills. But he did not understand that he would have died if she hadn't heard him calling for help. This place is probably full of booby traps too. How do I keep him from running off again? She watched him pretend shoot a bookshelf. Excuse me. She watched him pretend to shoot a bookshelf, wondering absently if the whole macho thing was just his way of dealing with fear. And a different approach suddenly occurred to her, one that she thought might actually work. He wants to play Mr. Tough Guy? Let him. Appeal to his ego. Steve, I understand that you're not looking for a partner, but I am, she said, doing her best to look sincere. I don't want to be alone out there. She could actually see his chest puff out and felt a huge sense of relief, knowing that it had worked before he said a word. She also felt a little guilty for manipulating him, but only a little. This was for the best. Besides, it's not lying exactly. I really don't want to be alone out there. I guess you could tag along, he said expansively. I mean, if you're scared. She only smiled, teeth gritted, aware that if she opened her mouth to thank him, she didn't know what would come out. And anyway, I know how to get us out of here, he added, his bluff manner slipping, his youthful enthusiasm spilling out. There's a little map under the counter at the front desk. According to that, there's a dock just west of here, and an airstrip somewhere past that, which means we have a choice. But my piloting skills are a little iffy, so I vote a cruise. We can go right now. Maybe she had underestimated him a bit. Really? Great, that's... Claire trailed off. Rodrigo. She couldn't forget about Rodrigo. Between the two of us, we could probably get him to the dock. Would you come with me back to the prison first? She asked. The guy who let me out of my cell is back there. He's pretty badly wounded. One of the prisoners? Steve asked, perking up. Uh-oh. She could lie, but he'd know the truth soon enough. I don't think so. But he did let me go, and I kind of feel like I owe him. Steve was frowning, and she quickly added, and it seems like the honorable thing to do, to at least get him a first aid kit, you know? He wasn't buying. Forget it. If he's not a prisoner, he works for Umbrella. He deserves dick. Besides, they'll be sending troops in soon enough. It's their problem. Let them deal with it. Now, are you coming or not? Claire met his gaze squarely, reading anger and hurt in his dark eyes, surely caused by Umbrella. She couldn't blame him for how he felt, but she didn't agree with him either, not in Rodrigo's case. And there was no question in her mind that he would die before Umbrella showed if he didn't get help. I guess not, she said. Steve turned away, took a few steps toward the door, and then stopped, sighing heavily. He turned back, clearly exasperated. There's no way I'm risking my neck to save an Umbrella employee, and no offense, but I think you're totally batshit for wanting to. But I'll wait for you, okay? Go give the guy a band-aid or whatever, and then meet me at the dock. Surprised, Claire nodded. Less than she'd hoped for, but more than she'd expected, particularly after his weird people will let you down rant. Oh. For the first time, it occurred to her why Steve might have said those things, why he was denying the trauma of what had happened, what was still happening. He was here by himself, after all. How could he not have abandonment issues? Claire smiled warmly at him, remembering how angry she'd felt as a child when her father had died. Being snatched away from one's family couldn't be much better. It'll be nice to go home, she said gently. I bet your parents will be glad. Steve's sneering interruption was immediate and extreme. Look, come to the dock or not, but I'm not going to wait all day, got it? Startled, Claire nodded mutely, but Steve was already striding out of the room. She wished she hadn't said anything, but it was too late, and at least she knew what not to say. Poor kid. He probably missed his parents like crazy. She'd have to try to be a little more understanding. With a last look around the strange little den, Claire started back toward the front door, wondering what to do about Rodrigo. Steve was right. Umbrella might already have a team on the way. They could tend to him, but she meant to get him stabilized before she left. She needed to find a vial of that hemostatic liquid. She didn't know about she didn't know much about triage herself, but he had seemed to think it would help. She opened both of the other doors in the hallway on her way back to the lobby, stopping briefly at the first to gaze in at a number of portraits, some kind of pictorial history room for a family called Ashford. There was a shattered urn on the floor, but nothing else of interest. Behind the second door was an empty conference room, only a few scattered papers and silence. Claire stepped back into the front hall, deciding that she should try the upstairs before retracing her steps, just above the bridge to the prison. And wasn't she looking forward to crossing that creaking nightmare again? There'd been a door she'd bypassed in order to keep up with Steve's trail. A tiny red light on the door caught her attention, like one of those laser pointer things. Her geometry professor had used one. The small light jerked toward her, and Claire looked up, following a pencil thin beam to. Ah! She dove for cover as the first shot bit into the tiles mere inches from where she stood, ceramic shards flying. She crashed behind one of the ornamental pillars as the second shot thundered through the lobby, shattering more tiles. She scrambled to her feet, trying to make herself as tiny as possible, wondering if she'd actually seen what she thought she'd seen. A thin blonde man with a rifle and a laser sight, wearing what looked like a dress uniform jacket from a yacht club, deep red, complete with puffy white cravat and gold braid. Like a child's idea of what nobility authority should wear. My name is Alfred Ashford, a pinched, snobby voice called out. I am the commander of this base, and I demand that you tell me who you're working for. What? Claire wished she had something brilliant to say, some snappy comeback, but she couldn't get any further than that. What? She asked loudly. Oh, there's no point in your fiend ignorance, he continued, his jeering voice moving a little, as though he were descending the stairs. Miss Claire Redfield, I know what you've been planning. I've known from the start, but you're not dealing with just anyone, Claire. Not when you're dealing with an Ashford. He actually tittered, a high, girlish giggle, and Claire was suddenly absolutely positive that he was a wacko. She was talking to a wacko. Yeah, and I keep him talking. You don't want to lose his position. She could see the tiny red lights flicker on the wall behind her as he worked to keep the pillar in his sights. Okay, Alfred, what is it that I'm planning? She jacked the question. She jacked the action on her semi as quietly as possible, making sure there was a round in the chamber. It was as though she hadn't spoken. Our legacy of profundity, supremacy, and innovation is beyond the question, Alfred said haughtily. We can trace our heritage to European royalty, my sister and I, and to some of the greatest minds in history. But then I don't suppose your masters told you that, did they? My masters? I don't have any idea what you're talking about, Claire called out, watching the flickering red dot, deciding that she could dart a glance out from behind the pillar's other side, maybe get a shot off before he could target her. The longer Alfred talked, the more strongly she felt that meeting him face to face would be a bad idea. Mentally ill people were unpredictable at best. He mentioned the sister, the children in that movie with the dragonfly. She didn't have proof, but her instinct shouted a resounding yes. It seemed he'd stayed the course, from creepy kid to creep. Of course, if you're willing to surrender yourself to me now, Alfred purred, I might be persuaded to spare you your life, providing that you confess the treason against your superiors. Now, Claire ducked her head around the pillar, gun up, and bam! Wood and plaster exploded next to her face, the shot splintering the pillar's molding as she pulled back. She leaned heavily against the pillar, her breathing fast and gulping. If you'd been a hair more accurate. Aren't you the fast little rabbit? Alfred said, his amusement unmistakable. Or should I say rat? That's what you are, Claire, a rat. Just a rat in the cage. Again, that insane, unnatural giggle. But it was receding, following him back up the stairs. Footsteps, and then the door closed, and he was gone. Well, doesn't that round out things nicely? What's a biohazard disaster without a crazy or two? It'd almost be funny if she wasn't so totally weirded out. Alfred was a Fruit Loop. Claire waited a moment to be sure he was gone, then exhaled heavily, relieved but not relaxed. She couldn't relax until she was well away from Rockfort, leaving Umbrella and the monsters and insanity far behind. God, but she was tired of this shit. She was a second-year lit major. She liked dancing and motorcycles and a good latte on a rainy day. She wanted Chris, and she wanted to go home. And since neither of those seemed likely at the moment, she decided she'd settle for a good solid nervous breakdown. A good solid nervous breakdown, complete with screams and floor-pounding hysterics. It was almost tempting, but that would have to wait, too. She sighed inwardly. Alfred had gone upstairs, so she thought she'd check out that other door she passed back near the bridge, see if she could find something for Rodrigo there. At least things probably won't get any worse, she thought dismally, feeling a strange sense of deja vu as she opened the front door. It felt so much like Raccoon City, but that had been a serious catastrophe rather than an isolated disaster. Big fat chance. All of it bites. Claire had no way of knowing that, compared to what lay ahead, things hadn't even started to get bad. Okay, that was chapter 4. You know what, I can probably read chapter 5. That said, I am going to have to get my tea or drink because my throat is drying up. Hold on a minute. Okay, back. Chapter 5. The alleged dock wasn't really a dock at all, much to Steve's disappointment, and there wasn't a boat in sight. He'd expected a long pier with pilings and seagulls, all that shit, and a half dozen ships to choose from, each of them stocked with full pantries and soft beds. Instead, he found a tiny, grungy platform that sat over an unpleasantly gray, lagoonish area, protected from the ocean by a ridge of jagged rock that he could barely make out in the dark. There was a pulpit kind of thing with a ship's steering wheel stuck on it at the edge of the platform. Probably some dumbass's monument to the sea, or whatever. A decrepit table with some trash on it, and a ratty, moldy old life jacket heaped in a corner, the once bright orange stained to a murky mustard color. Nothing Nothing bigger than a canoe was ever going to dock at this particular pier. In a word, lame. Great. So how did all those people get off the island? Backstroke? And if there's an airship, where the hell is it? Bad enough that now he had to find another escape. He also told Claire that he'd met. Bad enough that he now had to find another escape. He'd also told Claire that he'd meet her here. He couldn't just take off, but he didn't want to stand around waiting either. You could still ditch her. Steve scowled, irritably kicking at a rusted out hunk of random machinery. Maybe she was a little nosy, a little naive, but she'd saved his ass, no question. And her wanting to go back to help some wounded umbrella hand just because he set her free, that was, well, it was nice. It was a nice thing to do. Leaving her behind didn't seem right. Not sure what to do next, he walked over to the mounted steering wheel. Wasn't there some kind of sailor name for it? One of those port starboard ahoy words? He didn't know, and gave it a spin, surprised at how smoothly it turned considering how crappy the rest of the dock was. And with a low mechanical hum, the platform beneath his feet abruptly detached from the rest and slid out over the water, as giant bubbles started to break the water surface in front of him. Christ! Steve held on to the wheel with one hand, pointed one of the gold luggers at the rising bubbles with the other. If it was one of Umbrella's creatures, it was about to be breathing hot lead, and a small submarine rose up out of the water like a dark metal fish, the hatch conveniently popping open directly in front of his feet. A rung ladder led down into the sub, which appeared to be empty. Unlike the worn out surroundings, the little sub looked sturdy and well maintained. Steve stared at it, astounded. What was this shit? It was like some theme park ride. So weird that he wasn't sure what to think. Is it any weirder than anything else I've dealt with today? Point taken. The map he'd looked back at. The map he'd looked back. Sorry. The map he looked at back at the mansion had been vague, just a couple of arrows and the words dock and airstrip. And apparently you had to take a submarine ride to get there. Umbrella was one messed up company. He stepped down onto the top rung and then hesitated, his skin still red from the last unknown he'd stepped into. He didn't want to drown any more than he wanted to get baked alive. Ah, screw it. Won't know till you try. Again, point taken. Steve climbed down the ladder, and when he stepped off, he triggered a pressure plate in the floor of the sub. Above him, the hatch closed. He quickly stepped on again, and the hatch reopened. It was good to know he wouldn't suffocate, at least. The interior of the submarine was very plain, maybe as big as a large bathroom, bisected by the narrow ladder, There was a small padded bench on one side, the rear of the sub, and a simple control console in front. Let's see what we got here, Steve muttered, stepping up to the controls. They were ridiculously simple, a single lever with two settings. The handle was currently next to the upper setting, marked Main. The lower setting was marked Transport. And Steve grinned, amazed that it could be this easy. Talk about user friendly. He tapped the pressure plate again, sealing the hatch, wondering if Claire would be impressed by his discovery as he pulled the lever down. He heard a soft metallic thunk, and then the submarine was moving, descending. There was a single porthole, but it was too dark to see anything besides a few rising bubbles. The anticlimactic ride was over in about 10 seconds. The sub seemed to stop moving, and he heard a sharper metallic sound coming from the hatch, like it was brushing against something. Definitely not an underwater sound. Onward and upward. The hatch opened as he started to climb the ladder, gun firmly in hand, and he stepped out onto a metal platform walled in glass or plexi, surrounded by black water on either side. There were a few steps leading down to a well-lit hallway, where only the left-hand wall was made out of water. Yeesh. It was like the displays at some aquariums, where you could go through an underwater tunnel, look at the fish. He never liked those things, finding it way too easy to imagine the glass breaking just as a shark decided to cruise by, or something. Enough of that. Steve stepped down into the hall and followed it around two bends, deliberately staring straight ahead. It was the first time since the attack on the island that he felt really nervous. Not so much claustrophobic as a kind of primal fear that something would come flashing out of the dark water toward the glass. An animal or something else. A pale hand, perhaps. Or maybe a dead white face pressing against the window, smiling at him. He couldn't help it. He broke into a run, and when the corridor met the door that apparently led away from the water room, he called himself pussy, but was vastly relieved anyway. He pushed the door open and saw 3 zombies in all, and all of them suddenly quite eager for his company. Each of them turned and began to limp or stagger toward him. The rags of their clothing, umbrella uniforms, no question, hanging from their outstretched arms. There was a smell like a dead fish. One of them moaned, and the others chimed in, the wails strangely gentle in a way, kind of sad and lost sounding. Considering what Umbrella had put him through, he didn't feel a whole lot of sympathy. None, in fact. The room was half split by a wall, the 3 zombies on the left unable to see the Lone Ranger on the right, though maybe they could, he thought, peering closer. Each of the trio had eyes that seemed to glow, a strange dark red. They reminded him of a movie he'd seen once, about a man with super X-ray vision who saw all kinds of shit. Guess we'll never know what they see. Steve took aim at the nearest, closed one eye, and bam! Right through the old frontal lobe, a clean hole appearing in its gray-green forehead like magic. The creature's red eyes seemed to fade and go out as it dropped, first to his knees, then flat down on his face. Sploosh. Gross. The zombie's comrades took no notice, kept coming. The Lone Ranger's progress had been stopped by a desk. He continued to walk anyway, apparently not noticing that he wasn't going anywhere. Steve took out the next in line, same as the first, a one-shot kill, but for a different reason. He didn't feel all that great about it, shooting them down like that. It hadn't bothered him before, but back at the prison. Then it felt good, powerful even. He'd been stuck in that hellhole for long enough to be pretty righteously pissed, and having some control again had been like Christmas, like a great big Christmas present that some little kid had been waiting for all year, like he used to wait. Shut up. Steve didn't want to think about it. It was bullshit. So he didn't feel like clapping every time he wasted another. So he didn't feel like clapping every time he wasted another one of them. So what? All it meant was that he was getting bored. He hurriedly shot the last two, the shots seeming louder than before, practically deafening. A quick look around for anything useful. If paper clips and dirty old coffee mugs were useful, he was sitting pretty. He was sitting pretty, and he was ready to move on. There were two doors on the back wall, one on either side of the room. He picked left on general principles. He read somewhere that when given a choice, most people picked right. After checking his ammo, he walked past a big empty fish tank that dominated the left side of the room and cautiously pushed the door open, taking in as much as he could in a single glance. Dark, cavernous smells of salt water and oil, nothing moving. He stepped inside, sweeping with the logger, and laughed out loud. A rush of pure joy washing through his system as his laugh echoed back at him. It was a seaplane hangar, and there was one big ass seaplane sitting right in front of him. Big to him, anyway. He'd mostly flown in a little twin engine private plane. Thoroughly pleased, Steve walked toward the plane, which sat just below the mesh platform under his feet. He was an inexperienced pilot, but figured he probably knew enough not to crash the thing. First things first. Board her and check her fuel, general condition, learn the controls. He stopped at the edge of the platform and looked down, frowning. He was at least 10 feet above the front hatch, which looked to be locked down tight. There was a bank of machinery to his left, a few panels lit up. Steve walked over and looked at them. Smiling when he saw a control to power up the boarding lift. The system should also open the plane door, according to the tiny diagram. Presto, he said, flipping the switch. A loud and grating mechanical noise bellowed through the giant hangar, making him wince, but it stopped after a few seconds, as a two-man lift slid to a halt at the platform's edge. He stepped onto the lift, studying the standing control panel, and started to curse, every bad word he could think of, twice. Next to a trio of hexagonally shaped spaces were the words, "Insert proof keys here." No keys, no power. They could be anywhere on the whole goddamn island. And what are the chances that all goddamn three of them will be goddamn together? He took a deep breath, made himself calm down a little, and spent the next few minutes figuring out how the plane's controls were hooked up to the rest of the system, looking for a way to bypass the key. And after a careful, thoughtful deliberation, he started cursing again. When he finally got tired of that, he resigned himself to the inevitable. Steve turned around and started to search the area, peering into every dark crevice, formulating theories about where the proof keys might be as he ran his hands over the greasy, dust-lined machinery cabinets. And he decided that he was definitely going to dance all over the bones of the next umbrella employee he gunned down, just for working at such an unnecessarily complicated place. Keys and emblems and proofs and submarines. It was a wonder they ever got shit done. And so I'm only seeing the chat message. I mean, I was aware of it, but I was in the midst of reading. But yeah. Read chapter 4, we're on chapter 5. And I also need to sip a drink. Sorry. This is one of the smaller chapters too. Okay. The virus carrier was wearing a lab coat and its lower jaw had fallen off somewhere or had been broken off. It It gurgled and spluttered horribly, its wormy tongue flopping limply across its neck. Claire couldn't tell if it had been a man or a woman, although she supposed it didn't really matter. As pitiful as it was revolting, she put it out of its misery with a single shot to the temple and then searched the area. Working laboratory office, small inventory room, before stepping back into the hall, discouraged at her overwhelming lack of success. The entrance she'd been walking back to from the mansion had opened up into a reasonably big courtyard. Hard packed dirt and totally utilitarian, more like the prison than the palace. Although, even after searching a few rooms, she still couldn't figure out where she was exactly. Some kind of testing facility, maybe, or a training ground for guards or soldiers. Maybe just a building designed to destroy hope, she thought blackly, looking toward the front door. She walked in maybe 10 minutes ago, hoping that Rodrigo wasn't already dead, that Steve found a boat, that Mr. Psycho Ashford and his sister weren't planning to blow up the island, and in just 10 minutes, those hopes had been thoroughly stomped on. All she really wanted now was a goddamn bottle of medicine, because then she'd be one step closer to leaving. She tried the upstairs first, undergoing an exciting little adventure that had shaved a few years off her life. All she found up there was a small locked lab with a lot of broken glass on the floor, from what appeared to be ruptured holding tanks. She'd seen the damage through an observation window and had been about to leave when some poor bloody guy in an environmental suit threw himself at the glass. It had been his dying act. The suit obviously hadn't done him much good. His head had practically exploded, coating the inside of his helmet with gore. It hadn't done her heart much good either, scaring her life to death, and the whole upstairs experience had been topped off by emergency shutter lockdown, apparently triggered by the suit guy. She practically had to hurl herself down the stairs to avoid being trapped. Whee! 9 zombies she had to put down so far, 3 of them in lab coats or scrubs, and not even a cotton swab to show for it. Nothing in the locker room, and she'd looked through practically every damned one of the lockers, turning up jock straps and porn, but little else, nothing in the odd little shower room, zip and zilch. She'd have thought that a pharmaceutical company might actually have a few pharmaceuticals lying around, but it was looking more doubtful by the moment. Claire walked back to the long hall that branched off from the building's first floor, that opened into an outdoor courtyard. She hoped to find something for Rodrigo without having to leave the building proper, but there was no help for it. If I get lost, I can just follow the trail of corpses back, she thought, walking quickly down the nondescript corridor. Not funny, but she wasn't feeling all that politically correct at the moment. She was starting to run low on ammo too, which made her even less inclined to a positive frame of mind. She stepped down, she stepped from the relative warmth of the hall into a mist cloaked courtyard, smells of the ocean permeating the cold gray night. A small fire burned against one wall. The whole Rockford facility was strangely laid out, she thought, and unlike a mix of new and old. Inefficient, but interesting. The little courtyard was actually cobblestoned, definitely not a recent addition. Claire froze. The narrow red beam of a laser scope sliced through the mist in front of her, swept toward her from somewhere above, a low balcony to her right. The stairs for it set against the east wall. Stairs! Cover! It was all she had time to think before the little red dot was stuttering across her chest. She threw herself out of the way as the first shot blasted through the cold air, burying itself in a miniature fountain of stone chips. She rolled to her feet and sprinted for the stairs, the red light jerking back and forth, trying to find her. Bam! A second shot. It missed, but was close enough that she could actually hear it cut through the air. A high-pitched buzzing sound. She caught a glimpse of the shooter just before ducking behind the low stone balustrade. Not surprised at all to see slicked back blonde hair and a red jacket trimmed in gold. She was more angry than scared that, after all she'd been through, she hadn't been more careful, and that she'd almost been taken out by such a weird little elitist creep. That stops right now. Claire raised her handgun over the stone railing and fired off 2 rounds in Alfred's general direction. She was immediately rewarded with a cry of shocked outrage. Not so much fun when the peasants fire back, is it? Ready to capitalize on his surprise, Claire scrambled up 3 steps and risked a look over the rail, just in time to see him run through a door on the west wall, slamming it behind him. She leapt up the stairs and took off after him, banging through the door and down a moonlit hall, shafts of cool light gently piercing the shadows. It wasn't a conscious decision to pursue him. She just did it, not wanting to stumble into any more of his ambushes. She could see what looked like a soda machine at the end of the hall, could still hear his running footsteps, and heard a door slam just before she reached the corridor's end. A small room with 2 decrepit vending machines and 2 doors to choose between. Claire hesitated, looking at either door, and then put her hands on her knees to catch her breath, giving up the chase. For all she knew, he was standing on the other side of those doors, just waiting for her to walk through. Score 1 for the nutcase. Not a big victory, anyway. With any luck, she'd be off the island soon. Alfred Ashford, just another bad memory. After a moment, she straightened, walking over to check out the vending machines, one for snacks, the other beverages. She suddenly realized she was ravenous and incredibly thirsty. When was the last time she ate? The machines were both broken, but a couple of solid good solid kicks circumvented the problem nicely. Most of it was crap, but there were several bags of mixed nuts and a few cans of orange juice. Not exactly a steak dinner, but considering the circumstances, a bountiful harvest anyway. She ate quickly, stuffing a few unopened bags in her vest pocket for later, feeling more focused almost immediately. So, door number 1 or door number 2? Eeny, meeny, miny, moe. The gray door to the right of the corridor. She doubted that Alfred had the patience to still be waiting, but edged up to the door carefully just in case, pushing it open with the barrel of the 9mm. Claire relaxed. A small, cozy room, couple of couches, an antique typewriter on a table, a large, dusty trunk in one corner. It seemed safe enough. Alfred must have gone through door number 1. She stepped inside to search it, drawn toward a small heap of miscellaneous objects, one of the couches, and her breath caught in her throat, her eyes widening. Thank you, Alfred. Someone had dumped the contents of a fanny pack on the couch. The pack itself crumpled next to the pile, which included 2 sterile needles and a syringe, a pack of waterproof matches, half a box of 9mm rounds, and a small half-filled bottle of the same hemostatic stuff Rodrigo had been out of. Exactly what she'd been looking for. There were a few other odds and ends in the makeshift survival kit. A pen, a small flat screwdriver, a foil-wrapped condom. At the last, she rolled her eyes, grinning. Interesting, what some people considered absolute necessities. Her grin faded when she noticed the bloodstains on the pack, but she still felt better than she had in days. She reloaded the pack and strapped it low around her hips, transferring a few things over from her own woefully tight pockets. She could hardly believe her luck. The medicine was what she'd been most worried about, but it was also an incredible relief to find more ammo. Even a single clip's worth was a godsend. The search of the rest of the room yielded up nothing more. Not that she minded. She felt like the end was in sight, an end to this terrible and horrific night. Get back to the prison, give the drugs to Rodrigo, And see if Steve's had any luck wrangling us a ride home, she thought happily, stepping out of the room. It had been a hard ride, but compared to Raccoon, this was a picnic. The heavy rattle of the closing shutter whipped her around, the moments of happiness blown as the corridor, her exit, was blocked off with a thundering crash. No! Claire ran to the metal shutter, banged it once with her fist, already knowing that there was no chance. She was sealed in. The only possibility of escape now, the one door she hadn't yet tried, the one Alfred had fled through. Welcome, Claire, a voice called out, as snotty and pretentious as she remembered, with the same snid undertone as before. There was an intercom above one of the vending machines in the upper corner of the room. Howdy, Alfred, she thought dismally, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of her anger or fear. The whole compound was probably wired up for sound. She'd been stupid not to think of it. And just because she didn't see a camera, that didn't mean there wasn't one. You're about to enter a special playground of sorts, Alfred continued. And there's a friend of mine I'd like very much for you to meet. I think you'll play well together. Fantastic, can't wait. Don't die too soon, Claire. I want to enjoy this. He laughed, that insane, annoying, distinctly unnatural giggle of his, and then he was gone. Claire stared blankly at the door she was supposed to go through. Considering her options, it was probably the best thing Chris had ever taught her, that there were always options. They might all totally suck, but there was always a choice, regardless, and thinking over her alternatives now had a calming effect. I can hide in the safe room, live on snack food and pop while I wait for Umbrella to show up. I can sit here and pray that some friendly party will miraculously come to my rescue. I can try to get through the steel shutter or through one of the walls with that screwdriver and some elbow grease. I can probably break out in about 10,000 years. I can kill myself, or I can walk through Alfred's playground door, see what there is to see. There were a number of variations, but she thought that basically summed things up. And only one of them made any sense. Technically, none of them makes sense. Part of her howled. I should be in my dorm, eating cold pizza and cramming for some test. Objection noted, she thought dryly, reaching into her new pack for a full clip, tucking another in her bra for fast access. Time to see what Alfred and his underlings had been up to out here. See if Umbrella had finally come up with a formula for the perfect bio-organic warrior. Claire stepped up to the door and paused, wondering if she should go into battle with some profound thought about her life, or love, wondering if she was ready to die, and decided that she could worry about all that stuff later. If there wasn't a later, she wouldn't have to worry about it, would she? Boy, am I smart, she murmured, and pushed the door open before she could lose her nerve. Okay. So that was chapter 4 and 5. That will end the reading session here. Just going to try to take a look. I think the next chapter might be about the same length. But that's I do think chapter 4 is the longest of the chapters. Well, actually, you know what? There might be another one. It's really hard to tell. But either way, next time we'll be reading chapter 6. I don't know if it's going to be just one chapter, or actually two, just because BC is going to be hit with another heat dome, though slightly less severe as last year. But it might be a bit too hot where I'm going to have a difficult time reading. Maybe. We'll see. Either way, thank you for liking if you liked. Thank you for commenting if you commented. Thank you for subscribing if you subscribed. Thank you for favoriting if you favorited. Thank you for simply clicking on this video. Until next time, guys. See ya. Oh my god, my voice broke there. Oh no. Drink it.